On a cold Wednesday morning in November of 1983, a 16-year-old girl left her house in Flint, Michigan, to walk to her bus stop. It was a walk she had made 100 times. 6:30 in the morning, still dark, a few blocks, a bus, a school day. She never got on the bus. 4 days later, her body was found in a ditch along a rural road 35 miles from home. And then, for 42 years, nothing. No arrest. No name, no answer. Her mother grew old waiting. Her stepfather died waiting. The detectives who first worked the case retired, and the file boxes gathered dust in storage. But here is the part that still stuns the people who knew this story. The man responsible never ran. He never hid. He stayed right there, in the Flint area, for 4 more decades, playing bass guitar in local bands, working the same bars, shaking hands, telling jokes. People who drank beside him for years describe him as one of the nicest men they ever met. They had no idea. It took a new generation of DNA science, a team of Michigan State Police cold case detectives, and, remarkably, a group of college students the same age Sherry Jo Elliott was when she died, to finally put a name to the man who killed her. This is the true story of how a 42-year-old Michigan cold case was solved. And why the answer, when it finally came, arrived 3 months too late. Before we go back to that November morning, you need to understand the world Sherry Jo Elliott lived in. Flint, Michigan, in 1983 was a city holding its breath. This was General Motors country, a town literally built by the auto industry, where entire neighborhoods had grown up around the factories, where fathers and grandfathers had walked through the same plant gates for 50 years. By the early 80s, the layoffs had started, and times were getting harder. But the neighborhoods themselves still worked the way they always had. People knew their mail carriers. Kids walked to bus stops alone, and nobody thought twice about it. Because that's what kids did. The streetlights came on, the school buses ran their routes, and a Wednesday in November was just a Wednesday. Sherry Jo Elliott lived on Seneca Street, on Flint's side of that ordinary world. She was 16 years old, a high school student, and by every account that survives, she was exactly the kind of teenager a parent hopes to raise. People who remember her describe a girl who was shy, smart, and this detail matters, so hold on to it, careful around strangers. She was not a risk-taker. She was not a runaway. She was a quiet 16-year-old with a bus to catch. At home were her mother, Joyce, and her stepfather, Robert Schultz, a family that would spend the next 4 decades carrying what happened to her. There is a photograph of Sherry Jo that Michigan State Police would later release to the public, a teenage girl with the feathered hair of the era. The kind of school portrait that hung on refrigerators all over America in 1983. That photo would end up on missing posters, then in newspapers, then in case files, then, 42 years later, on the news one more time. But on the morning of November 16, 1983, she was just a girl leaving for school. It was around 6:30 a.m. when Sherry Jo left the house on Seneca Street and started walking toward her bus stop. November in Michigan means dark mornings, cold air, breath you can see, porch lights still glowing up and down the block. She was last seen waiting for the bus. And then, she wasn't there. The school day came and went. The bus made its afternoon run. And Sherry Jo did not come home. By that evening, her family knew something was terribly wrong. This was not a girl who wandered off. This was not a girl who skipped school without a word. Several hours after she failed to return home, she was reported missing, and the search began. What followed were 4 of the longest days a family can live through. law enforcement searched the area around the bus stop and found nothing. Community members joined in, neighbors, volunteers, people from the surrounding blocks, walking the streets alongside police and alongside Sherry Joe's own family. Flint in 1983 still had that instinct. When a child went missing, people showed up. The bus stop gave up no answers. No witnesses came forward with the piece that mattered. A 16-year-old girl had vanished from a city street in the early morning, and it was as if the morning itself had swallowed her. Then came November 20. 4 days after she disappeared, Sherry Joe's body was discovered along a rural road in Blumfield Township in Saginaw County, roughly 35 miles north of her Flint neighborhood. She was found partially clothed in a drainage ditch. Investigators determined she had been shot 4 times. She had been sexually assaulted, and there was one more finding, one that investigators would carry for the rest of their careers. Based on the evidence, authorities concluded that Sherry Joe had likely still been alive as late as November 19. 3 days after she vanished. 1 day before she was found. She hadn't been killed that first morning. Someone had held her somewhere. Her mother, Joyce, would say decades later that being told her daughter's body had been found was a horror no parent can describe. And yet, in the same breath, she said something that tells you everything about what these cases do to families. She said she was grateful. Grateful that Sherry Joe was found at all. Because if her daughter had simply stayed missing, if she had spent the rest of her life not knowing where Sherry Joe was, or what she might be going through, she did not believe she would have survived it. That is the arithmetic of grief in a case like this. Finding your daughter's body in a ditch is the merciful version. Now it was a homicide investigation. And in 1983, that meant detectives went to work with the tools of 1983. Understand what that meant. DNA evidence, as a crime-fighting tool, did not exist yet. The first criminal case ever solved with DNA testing wouldn't happen until 1986, 3 years later, and an ocean away, in England. The technology wouldn't become a routine part of American investigations until the early 2000s. In 1983, detectives had fingerprints, ballistics, witness interviews, and shoe leather. That was the toolbox. Investigators worked the case hard. Evidence was collected from the scene and from Sherry Joe's body, and this decision, made by evidence technicians in 1983 who could not possibly have known what science was coming, is the reason this story has an ending at all. That evidence was preserved, sealed, logged, and stored, year after year, decade after decade. The investigation itself, though, ran into walls. Leads were chased and went nowhere. Interviews were conducted and produced nothing that broke the case open. And like so many of these cases, suspicion turned inward before it turned outward. At one point, investigators looked at someone inside Sherry Joe's own home, her stepfather, Robert Schultz. Joyce always maintained her husband had nothing to do with it, and the eventual truth would prove her right. But imagine carrying that. Imagine burying your stepdaughter and then feeling the weight of official suspicion on top of the grief. That shadow sat over the family even as the real killer walked free 30 minutes away. Michigan State Police would later put it plainly, despite extensive efforts, the case went cold because the forensic technology of the time simply couldn't take it any further. The file boxes went into storage, the evidence stayed sealed, and Flint moved on, because cities always do, even when families can't. The years that followed are the part of this story with no scenes in it. Just time. The 1980s ended. The 1990s came and went. Flint changed around the case, plants closed, Neighborhoods emptied. The city that had searched for Sherry Joe slowly became a different city altogether. The detectives who had knelt beside that ditch in Blumfield Township worked other cases and then retired. The missing posters came down. The school portrait with the feathered hair became a photo in a folder. By 1993, 10 years had passed. By 2003, 20, somewhere in an evidence room, the sealed samples from November of 1983 waded through all of it. For Joyce, the passage of time didn't close the wound, it just taught her to live around it. She had her daughter's grave. She had her memories of a shy, smart girl who was careful around strangers. What she did not have, for 40 years, was a name. And while the family waited, the man responsible was living a full and public life almost within sight of them. He lived in Grand Blanc, a short drive from Flint, maybe 15 minutes down the road from the neighborhood Sherry Joe vanished from. He was a musician, a bass player, and by all accounts a good one. Good enough that people in the local scene gave him a nickname, Hendrix. He was a fixture in the Flint area music community for decades, playing in bands, gigging in bars around town. In later years, he played with a band called the Goodfoot, taking the stage from time to time at a bar and grill in Mundy Township, just south of Flint. The people who knew him from those nights did not know a killer. They knew a friendly face behind a bass guitar. One bar owner who hosted his band would later say he struck her as one of the nicest guys she had ever met. Think about the geography of that. For 4 decades, the man who took Sherry Joe Elliott's life was playing gigs in the same county where her mother lived, the same bars her neighbors drank in. He grew old in plain sight, 33 years old when she died, then 50, then 70, and nothing about his ordinary, sociable life ever pointed back to a ditch in Saginaw County. Nothing, that is, except a biological signature he had left behind in 1983, one he could never take back. If you find these stories worth telling, the cold cases that finally get answers, take 1 second to subscribe, because it genuinely helps this channel keep telling them. Now, back to the case. Because in 2023, everything changed. In 2023, 40 years, almost to the month, after Sherry Joe's murder, Michigan State Police cold case detectives reopened the investigation. They were not starting from scratch. They were starting from that preserved 1983 evidence. And they were bringing to it a technology that would have sounded like science fiction to the original detectives, forensic-grade genome sequencing. Working with the MES-P Forensic Science Division and Othram, a private forensic laboratory in Texas that specializes in exactly this kind of case, investigators went back to the biological evidence recovered from Sherry Joe and did what 1983 never could. They built a DNA profile of the unknown man who had left it. Here is the plain language version of how this works. Traditional DNA matching can only compare a sample against people already in a police database, and this man had stayed out of those databases his whole life. But modern genome sequencing reads far more of the DNA itself, enough to treat it like a family tree. Investigators can use it to identify relatives of an unknown suspect, then work down the branches, narrowing by age, by geography, by who was where and when, until the tree points at one person. And the detectives had help from one of the most remarkable partnerships in this entire story. Starting in 2023, students from Western Michigan University's cold case program joined the renewed investigation. These were vetted students, put through intensive confidentiality training before they were allowed near a single page. Their job sounds unglamorous and was anything but. They took decades of investigative material, the accumulated paper of a 40-year-old murder file, and reorganized it, digitized it, made it searchable and usable for the detectives working the DNA angle. Michigan State Police would later say publicly that these students were integral to solving the case. Sit with one detail here. Many of those students were roughly the same age Sherry Jo was when she died. 16 when she vanished, they were college kids poring over her file. The case had gone cold before most of them were born, before their parents had even met, and they were the generation that helped close it. The genealogy work, the lab work, and the reconstructed file all converged on the same answer. The follow-up investigation led detectives to focus on one man. Ronnie Collins, 75 years old, of Grand Blanc, Michigan. The details lined up with terrible precision. Collins was born on February 9, 1950, which made him 33 years old in November of 1983. He had previously lived in the same town as Sherry Jo, and at the time of her murder, he was a traveling musician working that exact area. The shy girl who was careful around strangers. The sociable musician everyone trusted. For 42 years, those two facts had never been placed side by side. Now detectives needed one more thing, a confirmation sample. A voluntary DNA swab from Collins himself, to compare directly against the 1983 evidence. They were closing in. They never got the chance to ask him face to face. In January of 2026, before investigators could obtain that sample, Ronnie Collins took his own life. Whatever he knew about November of 1983 and about anything else, he took with him. But he could not take back the evidence. Investigators collected DNA during Collins' autopsy and compared it against the biological evidence that had been preserved from Sherry Jo's body since 1983. It matched. On April 13, 2026, Michigan State Police made it official. Ronnie Collins was identified as the man responsible for the kidnapping, sexual assault, and murder of 16-year-old Sherry Jo Elliott. After 42 years, the case was solved. Police noted that although Collins would never face prosecution, the identification finally gave Sherry Jo's family and the community the answer they had waited 4 decades to hear. The reaction around Flint was disbelief. People who had known Collins for years, shared stages with him, served him drinks, called him a friend, struggled to reconcile the man they knew with what the DNA said. The owner of the Mundy Township bar where his band had played spoke for a lot of the community. Total shock, she said, and heartbreak for Sherry and her family. The nicest guy she'd ever met, and none of them had known his past. And then, the story got darker. After Collins was named, Michigan State Police revealed something else. Ronnie Collins had been a person of interest in another case, one even older than Sherry Jo's. On Halloween night, 1969, 2 teenagers vanished from the Oscoda area, up along Lake Huron. Their bodies have never been found. And Collins, investigators say, was in the Oscoda area that very night. He had spent time up there playing in bands. 57 years later, that case is still open. The families of those teens are still waiting for the kind of answer Joyce finally received. Michigan State Police are actively asking anyone with information about the 1969 disappearances, anyone who remembers Collins from those years, from those bands, from those bars, to come forward. Investigators have said openly that there may be more victims, which means the identification of Ronnie Collins may not be an ending at all. It may be a beginning. So how do you measure justice in a case like this? There was no arrest, no trial, no moment where Sherry Jo's family watched her killer stand before a judge. Collins lived 75 years as a free man and left on his own terms, a final act that denied the family even a courtroom. And yet, Joyce Schultz knows her daughter's killer's name. After 42 years, the question that sat at the center of her life has an answer. The suspicion that once touched her own husband is erased forever, though Robert Schultz never got to see it. He died in 2025, 1 year before the announcement, never knowing who killed his stepdaughter. That timing is one of the quiet cruelties of this case. The answer existed in a lab's pipeline while he was still alive. It arrived 12 months too late for him, and 3 months too late for a prosecution. But remember what made the answer possible at all. Evidence technicians in 1983, working 3 years before DNA testing, had solved a single crime anywhere on Earth, preserved the samples anyway, and preserved them well enough to survive 4 decades. Detectives who inherited a hopeless file refused to let it stay in storage. A Texas lab read a genetic signature the original investigators couldn't have imagined, and a group of college students, the same age Sherry Jo was when she was taken, spent their semesters turning 40 years of paper into the searchable record that helped detectives find her killer. This was the 21st case in Michigan alone solved with that laboratory's technology. Somewhere right now, another family's answer is sitting in another evidence box, waiting for the same combination of stubbornness and science. Sherry Jo Elliott would be in her late 50s today. Instead, she is forever 16, the shy, smart girl from Seneca Street who was careful around strangers and who did nothing wrong on a dark November morning except walk to her bus stop. Her case leaves us with questions worth sitting with. Should there be dedicated funding so that every preserved cold case sample in America gets this technology, instead of waiting decades for a reopened file? What do you make of a killer who hid not by running, but by being likable? And if you grew up around Flint or Oscoda in those years, is there a name, a night, a memory that never sat right with you? Because in this case, the police are genuinely asking. Tell me in the comments what this case leaves you thinking about. If you believe stories like Sherry Jo's deserve to be remembered, and that the still missing Oscoda teens deserve the same answer she finally got, subscribe and turn on notifications, because those are the stories this channel exists to tell. Sherry Jo Elliott, 1967 to 1983. Found in 4 days, answered in 42 years. Never forgotten.